For the first time, the use of a whip has been banned at a major racetrack in North America, if not the world. Just one of the significant victories in PETA's fight against cruelty in horse racing. We'll explain the new rules at Santa Anita Racetrack next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, the second part of our look into horse racing. After the deaths of nearly 24 horses in 2 months, PETA forced new rules of horse racing at Santa Anita, and it begins with an historic first, a ban on whipping.
This was very exciting to see. On the first day after they made these announcements, big signs were placed up at the track that stated that jockeys could hold the whips, they could carry them, but they could not hit an animal. No striking allowed is the term that they use. And it is so significant. I'm really happy that at the very least, the last sanctioned activity in the United States where an animal could be beaten has ended.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP, headed up the effort that worked with Santa Anita to come up with new rules when the track is scheduled to reopen March 29th. After 22 horse deaths since December 2018, the track had been forced to shut down. Now the new rules represent a massive shift in thinking at one of the biggest and most famous tracks in North America. It includes not just the historic end of whipping, but also reductions in the use of race day drugs, restrictions on their prescription, and closer scrutiny of veterinary practices. One rule change, a ban of the diuretic Lasix, will go through a phase-in. But the other rule changes adopted by the track got zero pushback. It shows how the deaths of horses, along with protests and investigations of PETA, have forced the industry to move faster to end the cruelty in the so-called sport of kings. On top of that is a new criminal investigation by the Los Angeles District Attorney into animal cruelty, something that state horse racing regulators don't do. And there's even new scrutiny coming from Congress. The new rules will first take place in California at Santa Anita in Pasadena and Golden Gate Fields in the San Francisco Bay Area, all tracks owned by the Stronach Group. The group intends to roll out the reforms to its other tracks in Maryland and Florida, meaning the handful of other major tracks in Kentucky and New York may be forced to adopt the same anti-cruelty rules if racing is to survive. Here's my conversation with PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo on how it all came about quickly after the death of the 22nd horse, the significance of the different rule changes, and what it means to the horses and to the future of racing on the PETA Podcast.
We have what looks to be the most significant change in racing in at least 30 years, or at least that's what you've said. Is it an overstatement or is that true?
It isn't an overstatement at all. It's very true that these are progressive, significant changes, and changes, I might add, we have been pushing for the last decade. And to see a major track, and when I say major, I mean very prominent track like Santa Anita, adopt these changes, it's huge.
And it's not just Santa Anita, but it's also Golden Gate Fields in Northern California in the San Francisco area. So we have California's major racing places and then other Stronach tracks too. Pimlico and Laurel in Maryland, Gulfstream in Florida. Are they going to follow?
The plan is to roll this out at all of those tracks. I know there will be negotiations that have to take place between the tracks and the thoroughbred owners in those states. But there's been a precedent set now, and that is the plan.
We're trying to do this segment here in a way to help people who hear the news, they see the headlines, but they don't quite grasp the significance of it all because they don't understand racing. This is like a major league player the Stronach Group. And when all the tracks are saying we're going to play by these new rules, it's significant.
It's significant. And, it's also an acknowledgement of what we have been saying for the last 5 years since we did our eyewitness investigation of trainer Steve Asmussen, where we showed the use of medication on a daily basis, and medication for horses, whether they needed it or not, like thyroid medication, with the weird belief that it would rev up their metabolism and make them go faster somehow. And this is an acknowledgement that that is wrong and dangerous for the horses, because the changes that they have put in place should allow them to see when horses are likely to be injured and not mask those injuries and then keep those horses off the track.
We'll get into the specifics in a second, but a lot of people will hear the headlines and they'll say, well, does this mean that no horses are going to break down, that we're not going to see any horse deaths?
That remains to be seen. They have to implement these rules and they have to enforce them properly. If they do that, it should be a major improvement. But trainers are, addicted to drugs for their horses. And there will be some illegal activity, I have no doubt. And I think it just remains to be seen what's going to happen. Of course, if there are further deaths, there's just going to be hell to pay. There's no question about it.
Hell to pay in terms of what? Public outcry, activist outcry? What do you mean?
Public outcry, congressional involvement, massive protests. The district attorney is already investigating the other deaths so far, perhaps more law enforcement involvement. But the public, I think, is already questioning why horse racing continues to exist anyway. If there are more deaths, that's just going to increase.
All these deaths within the last few months, that's when the public noticed, that's when the outcry began. And when the 22nd death happened last week, describe what happened there when the news of the 22nd death broke. And it also happened coincidentally at the same time that PETA was out in front of the LA District Attorney's Office calling for a criminal investigation. Describe how all these events coincided, how it happened.
That very morning that the horse died, I was in Los Angeles and I was prepared to head to our protest in front of the district attorney's office because we had called on the DA to put investigators on this case, not to leave it to the California Horse Racing Board, which we knew would not be investigating for cruelty to animals under state statutes, but simply for violations of horse racing statutes. The DA had not responded yet. So there were about 50 of us who were heading out there with signs, and we were going to take our message directly to District Attorney Lacey. Right before I got in the car to head to that protest, I got a call from the folks at Santa Anita saying that a horse had broken both front legs in a training exercise that morning, and that they were taking new and drastic actions to try to prevent this from ever happening again. So at the same time that we're calling on the DA, Santa Anita was getting ready to put these new proposals in place. And these are things we had talked with them about frequently over the last several years, because we knew that the beginning of the end of the deaths had to be the beginning of new drug regulations, the end of whipping, the end of so many practices that are so incredibly cruel.
You were about to protest. They were about to make the changes. But there was a little snag, too, because one of the changes, this ban on Lasix, and once again, we're going to get into all of them. It couldn't happen because of not a loophole, but there was a law that said it couldn't be a unilateral thing on the part of the track, but the owners, the thoroughbred owners, had to be involved too.
Yes, and I think it might help to go into what they have proposed in a little more detail. But first of all, Lasix is a diuretic drug. Some people who have various illnesses, including heart disease, may have had to take Lasix or some version of it at some point in their lives, so they know what it's about. It's used uniformly in the United States on the day of a race. Virtually every horse in the United States and Canada, thoroughbred horse who races, is put on this drug Lasix. And the excuse is that horses bleed a little bit in their lungs when they're pushed very hard, and that this drug stops that. The thing is, it's only in the United States and Canada. There is no other racing jurisdiction in the world where Lasix is allowed. And trainers really want to keep using it, they claim, for the safety of the horses. But what we know is it's also what they call a performance enhancer. Horses urinate out 15 to 20 liters when they're put on Lasix. They're lighter. It also masks other medications that they may have had. And there is this weird kind of addiction to the use of Lasix that trainers have. And it became very contentious. Santa Anita proposed that it be banned entirely. And the thoroughbred owners, whose cooperation is needed to make these changes, unless they're going to do a legislative fix on this or get the California Horse Racing Board to change the rule. So they compromised in the reduction of the dosage of Lasix from 10 cc's to 5 cc's and a phase out of Lasix beginning in 2020, which upset us, but is at least the beginning of the end of this medication.
Now, they don't even use Lasix in other areas where they race, like in Britain, in Australia, in Asia, right? Or certainly in the Middle East, there's no Lasix allowed. But in the United States and Canada, they use it.
That's right. And just since about the 1970s, so this whole generation of trainers, for the most part, have used Lasix their whole careers. But what's interesting to me is that while they claim they have to put their horses on this, this really devastating medication that makes horses dehydrated, it causes loss of electrolytes, they have to recover from the drug as much as from the race. These trainers who claim that it has to be used will then ship out their horses to a big race in Dubai, and the horse is not racing on Lasix. And all of a sudden, that's okay. So they speak out of both sides of their mouth on this.
But the reason why Lasix is used is because not only do the horses dehydrate and they pass their, the urine, but they also are able to dump out all the things that are in their blood that may have been used, right?
Yes, after a race, urine samples are taken. And if the horse has urinated out most of what's in its body, then it certainly hides some of the medication that it may have. And that's part of the reason why it's important to get rid of it entirely.
But because of the law that said that it can't be a unilateral thing on the part of the tracks, that thoroughbred owners had to be consulted, there was pushback, and then instead of an outright ban on Lasix, there was this phase-in. Is that something to be upset about?
I think it's something to be upset about. But I also think it's very interesting that there was no pushback on a whole lot of other very common and cruel practices in racing. For example, the injection of corticosteroids into the joints of horses. This is a terrible practice because not only does it mask the pain, meaning that a horse won't show an injury and may break down for that reason, but it over time destroys the joints entirely. That's now banned at Santa Anita. There's a practice called Shockwave therapy that's a very cruel process that also masks pain ultimately, and that is now prohibited. All of whipping is prohibited. There's a sign up at Santa Anita now that says you can carry a whip, but you cannot strike a horse with it. And that's the very first. This is the very first time in the whole world that has been implemented. There are other things too. An investment in diagnostic equipment that's going to show pre-existing injuries in horses, transparency in all veterinary records, greater limitation on the drugs that we have been so concerned about, and much more.
So all of these other things were listed in this new document that the Stronach Group said this is going to happen now at Santa Anita. The only pushback was on Lasix. What does that tell you?
It tells me that trainers have a bizarre connection to this one medication, and they're going to have to be forced to give it up. Essentially, they have agreed that beginning in January, no 2-year-old horses, and 2 is the unbelievably young age that horses are forced to race, no 2-year-olds can be on it. And after that, so we will see, if they stick to that at Santa Anita, we will see an end to the use of Lasix at at Stronach tracks entirely by about 2024.
Now, it also creates a little problem for people who follow racing and they're trying to compare how horses run in California, and if they ship to, say, New York to run a race, or Florida, or to other places where Lasix isn't used or is used, it may make it hard to compare if a horse is going to run up to its standard on any given race. It suddenly makes horse racing almost, well, I wouldn't say impossible to play as a sport, but it makes it a tougher game if you're one of those gamblers out there who.
It's impossible now. Who knows what medication horses are on? It's all secret. It's what the horse's real condition is, how many drugs he's been given in the week before, if he's had joint injections. All of these things are secret from bettors now. So I don't see any difference. What will be interesting to see is if trainers who have a horse at Santa Anita, if they have a 2-year-old next year and that horse is not on Lasix, if that trainer then goes to another state where Lasix hasn't yet been prohibited, what's he going to do? I think that's going to be interesting to watch. And it also points to the need to make sure that every other track in the United States enacts these same rules or stronger.
All right. So Lasix, we talked about how the importance of Lasix is this phase in. We're going to have to wait and see what happens. But that was the most contentious of all the proposals, but the other ones weren't. Race day meds is a big part of the proposal. That was not objected to. That's going to go into effect.
Well, the amount of drugs that can be in a horse's system has been drastically lowered for many of the typical pain and anti-inflammatory medications, which means that phenylbutazone, or as it's called, bute or butazolidine, which is a very strong anti-inflammatory that can be given to a horse 24 hours before a race, cannot be given now 24 hours before. And this is important because with increased inspections of horses before they get on a track, if they're not on those painkillers, if they're sore, if they've got an injury, then the veterinarian has a chance of actually seeing it. And again, all of these things are important. They're major improvements, and yet we still have so many issues with racing. So it's the beginning, and I just feel that I need to emphasize this is the beginning of making things better for horses. But it may and probably will mean much less suffering, and that's why it's important.
All right, let's go point by point, some of the other items. Shockwave, joint therapy, the significance there.
Well, that's a very painful procedure that's done on horses who have sore legs. And it's a little bit difficult to explain. If you actually Google and look at a video of it, it looks kind of benign. But it's very painful for the horses, and it deadens the feeling in their legs. So if they've got an injury, then they're not showing it. That's why that's important.
And so they can't do that anymore with this proposal.
That's right.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I want to mention it now more specifically, the idea of whipping being banned. And this is a big deal because I know that when I first started looking at racing in the 80s, people were talking about it. And that was a long time ago that people were talking about whipping, and nothing ever happened. And now they're actually doing something about it. So talk about how significant the ban on whipping will be.
This is one of the best things to come out of these new rules, in my opinion. When we objected to the whipping of a horse called 8 Bells, who was a filly who came in second in the 2008 Kentucky Derby, and as she crossed the finish line, she broke both front legs. And they're whipped down that stretch, down the last part of a race, in such a way is that there's no other way that you can look at it other than to say that is beating an animal. And honestly, people in racing say these horses love to run. Well, if they love it so much, why are you beating the heck out of them to get them to do it? It really made no sense. After we objected to the treatment of 8 Bells, they redesigned the whip, and they made something they call it an air cushioned whip, which really meant there was a padding at the end of the whip, and they put a broader, flatter end to it so that it wasn't so sharp. It wasn't quite as painful, but it's still beating and overdriving a horse. And we have been objecting to this for 10 years now. So to see this happen, I think, is really significant. when a horse comes around that final curve and is going into what they call the stretch up to the finish line, why are you hitting them? I mean, why? There is no good excuse for this. And the acknowledgement on the part of Santa Anita and indeed on the part of the trainers and the owners that they don't need it, I think is just groundbreaking. The very least we can do for these animals is not beat the hell out of them as they go down across the finish line.
And it's really one of the most graphic examples of cruelty that you'll see if you go to a horse race or if you watch them on TV. You see the beating; it's there, and it's funny to have heard jockeys try to defend whipping by saying they took the newly designed whip and they would hit themselves and say, "Hey, see, it doesn't hurt, But I'm sure they're not hitting it with the same kind of vigor that they do in a race. So this is a big deal. And tell me about the signs that are already up at the Stronach tracks in California.
Yes, this was very exciting to see. On the first day after they made these announcements, big signs were placed up at the track that stated that jockeys could hold the whips, they could carry them, but they could not hit an animal. No striking allowed is the term that they use. And it is so significant. I'm really happy that at the very least, the last sanctioned activity in the United States where an animal could be beaten has ended.
And what about the other tracks now? Stronach does this. I mean, not just, all the items on this list are important, but some are going to be more contentious, like Lasix. But in terms of whipping, which saw no pushback from the owners in Santa Anita, when that goes through, what are the prospects of other tracks around the country adopting that?
They whip everywhere. And this is one of the reasons that this was so progressive here. And, it sounds, even as I hear that come out of my mouth, it's progressive that they're not beating the animals. It sounds ridiculous to hear myself say that. And yet it's very important. I think other tracks will have to follow suit. The discussion within the racing industry itself is, will we survive what is going on right now? Can racing survive the scrutiny of the public? And that's a very good question. The public doesn't want to see abuse. They don't want to see horses die. And I think they have come to recognize at this point that the days of this overt abuse are limited.
And really, it took the 22nd death or up to the 22nd death for this to happen, where the racing industry realized that the public isn't ignoring this. The public is watching this more than they are watching and going and betting on the races. And I think when that balance was tipped over, they had to come to grips with this idea that they can't just ignore all these things that now the general public is seeing blared out on the news with this 22nd death.
The 22nd death was so shattering, and quite literally shattering for the horse's bones. But it was such a stunning piece of news as we were headed to the district attorney's office for our protest. And there was a television crew that was at the track that morning and filmed this horse exercising or in a training session, breaking both front legs, standing on those broken front legs. They were broken off at the shin. And so the front of the horse was lower than the back of the horse because the horse was actually standing on those broken bones. It was appalling. And it was probably that as much as anything. Also, our protest, 50 people yelling out in front of the district attorney's office. I heard that afternoon from an assistant district attorney that they have assigned investigators to look into the deaths of all 22 of these horses.
The veterinary community has to be a little concerned here because, especially the vets who are closely associated with the tracks, because how is it that they were able to either not see certain things with horses that ultimately broke down? How is it that they were able to pass horses and allow them to race? Or is there even that kind of scrutiny? Is there anything in the recommendations that puts pressure on the veterinarians to be better at what they do so that we don't see the breakdowns?
Yes, there are. And the first most important new rule is that a horse cannot be given a medication unless that horse has a specific diagnosis of an actual illness or injury. And it sounds like that should be evident. Why else would you give a horse medication? But it's a very bizarre culture in racing where they hear about some drug that may or may not work. And let's try that. And they toss it in the feed. And we uncovered this in our investigation of trainer Steve Asmussen, that they were giving virtually every horse in their barn, a scoop of thyroid medication. And just based on the idea that perhaps it will speed up their metabolism and they will run faster. And this happens all the time. I hear from people now that the drug of the day is an osteoporosis drug, biophosphonates, that maybe if we throw that in the horse's feed, his bones will get stronger and he'll heal faster. It turns out that it probably has the opposite effect, that the kind of healing that is needed is not as good as just allowing the bone time to recuperate. So this new rule will mean that no medication can be given unless there's an actual need for it.
Just to put a little exclamation on that point, the idea that veterinarians would say, oh, let's just throw this in, let's just use this drug, you never know, as a kind of preventative measure, without diagnosis, but saying, oh, well, maybe this drug might be good. And maybe we'll prevent something that doesn't exist now. I mean, it just seems crazy.
It is crazy. And to be fair, I think most of these requests come from the trainers, because the trainers are saying to the veterinarians, keep my horse on the track. And, hey, I heard about this. Let's try this. It is entirely crazy. And I have heard from people in racing that there will be trainers and owners and horse people sitting around coffee in the morning before the morning workouts, and they'll be talking about this or that medication they heard about and how so-and-so is trying it. It's hard for the racing authorities to stay ahead of all of these medications because they're not illegal until somebody figures out they're being used improperly. And that's the significance of making sure that no medication is given without an actual diagnosis.
It's almost like a preemptive use of drugs to prevent something that hasn't happened from happening. And it's all a kind of an excuse to maybe take advantage of the stimulative effect of that drug, or to take advantage of whatever that drug might do to make a horse run faster. Because after all, that is really the thing that the trainers and the owners want. They just want their horse to run faster. They don't care if it's sick. They don't care if it's well. They just make the horse run faster. And that's the illness. The horse doesn't run fast. That is the illness they're trying to cure. And the only thing they can come up with is give the horse more drugs, even if it doesn't need it.
One veterinarian I know who has become disgusted with the typical practices in the horse racing industry, when she testified before a congressional committee, she said, horse racing is not a diagnosis. And that's what's happening. It is anything that might give us an edge. What can we do that might make my horse go a little faster? And it's very twisted and bizarre. I think the rules help to deal with some of that.
Yeah, and I think that of all the other, concerns, like for Lasix, I think this rule that was gone, that went unchallenged, is really significant. Where meds with diagnosis only, it makes the veterinarians more responsible. Things have to be more transparent. And probably, have you heard anything about the vets being concerned about having to do their jobs, in terms of, helping the horses more than the trainers?
The vets seem to be remarkably silent on this. I have heard from some thoroughbred owners who don't like the way the system works now, that their medication bills every month are $500 to $1,000. So that's how much medication a horse is getting. The other significant improvements mean that the veterinarians who are employed by the state and who inspect the horses before they get on a track, all of this will be important for them, because if the horses aren't on so many medications, then they're going to be able to see if that horse is injured and keep the horse off the track. That's the hope. Part of what they're also requiring is that any horse who is going to train or race has to be at the track at least 2 days before. And all of the veterinary records have to be transparent. And by that, they mean that the people who are observing have to be able to see what medications the horse have been on. And this will give them some indication about whether or not the horse has been injured.
So this is really significant because it means that you can't just have these surprise breakdowns. You're going to have a sense that something's wrong first. And, it won't be as much of a mystery, at least from a veterinary perspective or from a medical perspective. Tell me about the further bans on other anti-inflammatories, because more than the Lasix ban, this is a real key thing here too, because Lasix makes a horse, urinate, and it flushes all the bad things out of its system, so it can't be found. So it's a masker. But when you directly ban anti-inflammatories, that's an important thing. Now you can't use the actual drugs that might make a horse run faster.
That's right. And I wish it were as clean as no medications in the week or 10 days before a race. The way that they do it is that they have a certain amount of a medication that is allowed in the horse's system on the day that horse races. And those allowable amounts have been hugely reduced. So that means that effectively, it means that in those days leading up to a race, the horse can't be on those medications. And just to go over again what they do, a horse in any given week can be given 10 or 15 injections of anti-inflammatories, pain medications, muscle relaxants, sedatives, any number of drugs that they just give routinely to horses. All of that's going to have to change at Santa Anita now. If the horses are being medicated, if they have an actual need for it, then they can't race. And if they are being given those medications with an actual diagnosis, then it has to be long enough before a race so that the horse isn't still feeling the pain masking effects of those medications. So in other words, they would show if they are limping or have an injury.
And the track is behind this all. And now it's up to the other tracks to say, hey, we should follow suit or not.
It is, and they must. And we will be insisting on that. And I also have to say, we're going to be watching very closely. How this is implemented, how it's enforced is all very important. The real litmus test is what happens with the horses. We simply cannot have horses dying on racetracks. It cannot be. Racing has many, many, many problems, but this is obviously one of the most crucial, and they've got to prevent these deaths.
So tell me about the DA's investigation, the criminal investigation, which is now underway. And how is that going to get you closer to where you want to be with a complete ban on Lasix? How is this going to put pressure on the owners and trainers?
In the past, when there have been problems with horses who have died or other infractions of rules or racing statutes, it's investigated by the California Horse Racing Board, but it's not really a criminal investigation. We went to the district attorney because we think that medicating a horse and forcing that horse to run is a criminal action. It's a violation of the state anti-cruelty laws. The California Horse Racing Board does not enforce state anti-cruelty laws. Law enforcement does. And we knew the district attorney would have the authority to investigate for violations of the anti-cruelty laws. And that's a different ballgame. It's one thing to be fined $500 by the California Horse Racing Board. It's another thing to be prosecuted for cruelty to animals. And we wanted to make the point that this is cruelty and it has to be stopped.
The DA is taking this seriously, but unfortunately, they have to work with the California Horse Racing Board. So how are we guaranteed an unbiased, impartial investigation here?
Well, there are no guarantees under the law, but I don't know of a time where the district attorney's office in a county has investigated for cruelty because horses have died on the track. So that's groundbreaking, and I think we have to put our our faith in the district attorney's office that they are going to seek out the experts they need. And certainly we've offered our assistance, and we have offered experts who can also address these issues.
Now, on top of the DA's investigation, there's Congress that is saying, we're going to look into this. The member of Congress representing Santa Anita, Representative Judy Chu, is very forthright here. She's saying this is cruelty. She wants to get to the bottom of this. How is congressional action? How is this going to help save horses at Santa Anita?
It's really important for there to be some congressional questioning about this, both locally with Representative Chu and also nationally, because there are 38 different states where horse racing occurs, and there is no federal oversight of what happens in racing. Every state has its own laws. So first of all, it's significant that a member of Congress is questioning, why are horses dying on this track? Let's get to the bottom of this. Let's prevent it. That's important, first of all. And it's also important nationwide for there to be some federal oversight and some way to make all of these rules, which we hope are improving, uniform across the country.
What Representative Chu has done is she's co-sponsored a piece of legislation that was introduced maybe 2 Congresses ago. What are the prospects of that legislation doing anything for the good of the horses?
It's always difficult to get a law passed. The Horse Racing Integrity Act was introduced as a response to our investigation of trainer Steve Asmussen and the drugging issues that we exposed in that. And we always have high hopes when there's a bill introduced, but it's very hard to get any bill passed. But I do think that the more horses die and the more attention is focused on it, the more difficult it is for the racing industry to ignore it and simply to say, well, we have this bill, that's good enough. Right now, any track can do what Santa Anita has done. They can make their own rules. They can work with the owners and the trainers in their area, flex their muscle, and they can make things better for horses. A federal bill sends a great message, but if we wait around for that bill to pass, a lot more horses are going to die.
If no other horses die, and if the spotlight isn't there, then does racing just continue in this, it's found a new level to go under the radar? Or is this something where we have to see maybe more news coming out of the bad news coming out of the racetracks if we want to see what we want to see happen to racing?
Well, bad news comes out every day. It just depends on who's reporting it in the news. But there are deaths every single day on racetracks in the United States. It's what we have now is a public that isn't going to stand for it. And we have a track that's going to lead the way in beginning to make the change. So I think it's important to note all those things and to stay away from the track as long as the abuse continues.
A lot of people who follow racing, I'm talking about the turf riders and the industry folks, they kind of poo-poo what PETA did at first. I mean, there seems to be a split. There's some people who say, thank goodness PETA's behind this because they want to see their industry saved. But there's some people who think that, well, horse racing isn't going to be smart enough to take any kind of guidance and try to change things for the good. And there's still another group that says this is the beginning of the end. Where do you see this all ending up?
Well, I wish I had my crystal ball. The racing industry gets smaller and smaller every year. We have a public that increasingly turns away from it. And the more, what the racing industry has traditionally done is pretend that this is all going to go away and everything is going to be fine. I think this is one of the few times in the 10 years I've been working on this issue that I've seen the racing industry say, oh my God, we're in trouble. We better make change. So I see, and I may be overly optimistic, but I see change coming down the road at a lot of tracks if we stay on top of this.
PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo on the new rules at Santa Anita Racetrack in California, including the ban on whipping, an historic ban, and how the reforms at the Stronach tracks in California could lead to massive reforms in the entire industry, or else. Get more information and take action about the future of horse racing. Go to PETA.org for more information, and go to the show notes for links to the videos, like PETA's undercover investigation on trainer Steve Asmussen, which exposed the problems of drugs in racing 5 years ago. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. Incidentally, if you're a regular listener to our show, you know Kathy Guillermo is my wife. Listen to this episode, episode 60, and also episode 59 for the full rundown on the new rules at Santa Anita. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. Thank you for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.